Yes, I'm from the art movement Intentism, so thank you very much for welcoming me here. The beginning part, or the first half of what we're going to be looking at tonight, is to try and lay the foundations of why the art movement began organically to grow with various artists, not just in England but in Europe. What were the reasons for that? Because various artists were feeling the same way, and then we, through sort of internet and through online, we started to share these ideas, and then Intentism grew up from that. But if we don't have a grounding of where the arguments were, then perhaps the reason why a lot of people are passionate about the movement and the theory behind it won't be apparent. So forgive me if the first half an hour or whatever might be a little bit heavy with theory or philosophy. It's not meant to be, but it's just so you can understand where we're coming from a little bit. Okay, so Intentism, who are we? There's a slide there that explains it. We're an international arts movement. We're comprised of fine artists, poets, writers, musicians, actors and philosophers from all over the world. After the talk, if you're interested, I've got a small selection of some of the published books by members of the art movement. There are a couple of philosophers. There's a Canadian philosopher and an American philosopher in particular that are quite prolific in writing on art theory and the idea. It's called intentionalism, which is a theory that buttresses this movement. It's one of the fastest art movements in the UK at the present time. I would think possibly Stuckism is arguably the only art movement in England that's growing any quicker than we are. So we're moving quite rapidly because a lot of people feel that they share the same voice as we do. The name Intentism, why are we called Intentism? Well, it's a response to the debate around authorial intent. Okay? It's a response to people arguing and discussing the idea of a creator or an artist's intention. Is it important? Is it relevant? Does it matter what the speaker or the artist author is intending when he or she says or paints or writes? Can we ignore it? Or is it important? Is it integral to the meaning of what they write or what they paint? Intentism maintains that the meaning of the work is the imperfect outworking of intention. Doesn't sound very controversial, but you find actually it very much is. Very controversial. So intention is where you find meaning in a finished work. I just want to give a little bit of a background of a few ideas related to intention and meaning before we look at art, because I want you to see with me that intention and people's intentions matter a great deal when we understand what people are saying, or what people are writing, what people are doing, or just in everyday life. So let me give you a couple of examples. Think of these two pairs of analogous events, okay? After a violent altercation, two men in Glasgow run over a 39-year-old man. These are true stories that happened. So they've been drunk, they're violent. In Glasgow, they run over a 39-year-old man, leaving him for dead, and they just go off. Or an OAP fails to see a pedestrian and knocks him down. So same result, but different intentions. Or what about a man incensed over unrequited love, tracks down the object of his desires and shoots her dead, shoots her coldly dead? Or a woman from South Africa shoots and kills her attacker during an attempted rape. They're all tragic events, aren't they? But should they be treated as equally terrible? The intentions were vastly different. In law, distinctions are made based on the perpetrator's intentions. Okay? And I like to say that in art, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. So, intentism. What's all the fuss? What's all the fuss? It's the belief of me and other various members of the intentist movement that intentions matter in the arts as well as in law. I'd like you to look at this frame and visualise, if you don't mind, in the blank screen there, an artwork of your own. Is it a painting? What kind of painting? Is it a landscape? Maybe through the frame you're looking at an installation of something that you've done, or a photograph. Let me say, as the viewer looking at your work, the work you're visualising on the screen now, it's racist. The work is racist. For me, your work means that white people are the master race, and I'm shocked and offended. As the creator, do you have the authority to tell me I'm wrong? Because the majority of art theory and literary theory, that art theory, a lot of it comes from, will say you don't. Can your work mean different things to different people? Can it mean racism for me? Can it mean anything? A lot of thinkers, where the theory comes from, people like Derrida and other people like that, more or less say it can mean anything. But if it means anything, then it means everything. And the result, if it means everything, in many ways it means nothing. Your art is silent, you have no voice, because I will tell you what it means. And other people will tell you what it means. Conversely, intentism believes that all meaning is the imperfect outworking of intention. This major tenet of intentism may sound controversial, but it's common in most theory to believe the opposite. This theory is commonly rejected based on lots of arguments that we'll go into very briefly in a minute. Some of them are things like, am I aware of all my reasons for what I do? Some people will say, forget the idea of intention meaning anything because you're not aware of everything. What about all the unconscious thoughts and feelings that you might have that you're not aware of, that then become imbued and manifest in the work? Might I not subconsciously disclose Freudian slips in my work that I'm not aware of? It's not part of my intention. What about what I communicate? As a literate person, won't the clarity of my words or art speak for themselves? That's a major argument. If it's not in the work, then it shouldn't be in the meaning. You shouldn't be giving me extra information. We call it extrinsics. If it's not in the work's failed. So as a literate person, won't the clarity of my words or art speak for themselves, regardless of my intentions? Furthermore, do all readers approach the same work identically? For example, each time a couple listens to a piece of music and says, this is our song, doesn't the ballad acquire a new meaning? Isn't it your song, your meaning? These are all the arguments that manifest themselves when we look at intention and meaning. To many, these questions expose intentionalism and therefore our movement in the arts as an obvious fallacy, a fake, a fraud. We say not so. This debate has raged in different guises over the centuries for a reason. The reason is it hits at the heart of what sets us apart from other animals. It's not just about art, it's about how we communicate and whether we can communicate. Is it possible for me to communicate? Yes, communicate, communal, together, union, communicate what I have with you. Is it possible? I hope to persuade you that by believing creative meaning is the outworking of intention, which is the theory of intentism, it does a couple of things. It doesn't limit the work. It's only what the intention is. It doesn't limit the work like that sounds. It frees up both the artwork and the artist of the restrictive tyranny of denying the artist has his identity and his intentions. It doesn't just free up the artist, it frees up the artwork, but I'll explain that more a little bit later on. This talk then, give you a brief outline of what we're saying. This talk will firstly look at the theory. That's the bit I said might be a little bit boring, but it's very important for you to see why this art movement has come naturally from all the theory that has infiltrated most art universities, certainly continental philosophy art universities in Europe, but also analytical philosophy in England and America. So we'll have a look at that. Secondly, we'll look at how grounding meaning as the imperfect outworking of intention actually liberates the work, which is what I was saying. And lastly, we'll look at some examples of the artwork of the art movement, so you can see how it works in practice. Okay, there will be some time for questions at the end, I'm sure. And I'll also point out to you with the sheets in the front there, if any of you are interested in finding out more, in subscribing to our monthly e-letter, various ways of getting involved, maybe participating more practically than that with your own artwork, or various things you can do. We'll mention a little bit more about that later on. Okay, today we are told that we have innumerable influences on our decision-making processes, both conscious and unconscious. We really are not able to say what a work means. That's what a lot of art theory is telling us. Moreover, since each viewer comes to a work with a different background, you've all got different backgrounds, some of the backgrounds you have you may not even be conscious of, but they're all very, very different to mine, it will mean that the work has a different meaning to you. That is the basis of art theory, particularly we call it hermeneutics, the art and science of interpretation that intentism has found itself in. Well, let me begin by briefly mentioning some of the leading thinkers that have shaped the arguments, and then we will trace, after looking at the major figures, the people, we'll look at the social and economic factors that have influenced where we are today as well, because we don't live in a vacuum. These are the things that have influenced the way we think about art and meaning today. So let me look first of all at the various people. Okay, there are three there, big, well-known, influential giants in art theory and literary theory, and in philosophy actually. During the Romanticism of the early 18th century, the author was much more central. We would have been, in some senses, less controversial. We were a central figure in hermeneutics. Scholars would seek out what they would call the genius. Scholars would try and find out who the genius was behind a piece of work, literary or visual work. However, the 20th century saw a monumental change in approach, and much of it was shaped by these three people. First of all, at the top, Gadamer. He was from 1900 to 2002, and he was author of a very well-known book called Art and Method. And he wrote about, amongst other things, the effective history of the work. The effective history of the work means, which you're taught a lot in art schools, that an artwork has a living quality. You've probably heard a lot of artists say, when I finish the work, I've just got to let it go. Let it live on, let it go. And this comes from Gadamer, that there's an effective history of an artwork. Okay? You don't think about the history of people, of beings, of living entities. We have an effective history of a work as well. And what this means is that a work or a text can be seen by various people from different generations, different cultures, different sects, different ages, and these people will look at the work differently, and they'll add new meaning to it. So the work changes meaning and also has different meanings added and attached to it, and that's the effective history of the work. This is also being called period eye. So some people say that you look at a work in the 18th century and we are physically unable to know the meaning of that work because we live in a different period. We don't have the same period eye. Okay, influenced by Heidegger, Gadamer also said some other things. He spoke about the fusion of horizons. The fusion of horizons basically is this. It's similar to what we're looking at with the effective history. The fusion of horizons says that a work has a horizon from one end, like any horizon you can see, to the other, of meaning. But as the work is seen by different people and different cultures, new horizons are attached to it, of meaning and understanding. And we have the same. When we go and meet different people, we grow, we change, we visit different places. We have different horizons that constantly grow. And for us to understand a work, the fusion of the art has to match the fusion of our own horizons. And if we don't have that fusion, we never understand it. So there's some truth in that, isn't there? If you have a very different background to me, maybe I can understand you to a certain extent, but I can't properly empathise with you until I have a similar experience. And then there's that fusion. Okay? So most people, I would think, would readily accept that's true. The problem with Gadamer is he said that it's not just empathy. It's not if I share your background, I can empathise with you. I don't understand you. I don't understand the work at all. It's blind to me. It's incomprehensible. Gadamer didn't say this was a problem. He said this is a good thing. He said this is how work should be. This is true understanding, where there's all these different horizons and complications. That's how work should be understood. The problem with this is this argument, Gadamer was using an argument based on Heidegger that was about texts. And it doesn't work in the same way with the visual arts. The reason is it's a discursive model based on art, which is text, that's linear. And one of his main arguments is with a text, it's sequential. It goes from the beginning through to the middle, through to the end. And he says it's the same as our lives. Our lives, we are born, we have experiences, and we die. So we both have this narrative. His whole argument's based on narrative. And if we have a fusion of our narrative with the narrative of the text, then we understand it. The problem is, as you know, that artwork, a lot of artwork, is a narrative. Not all, but a lot of artwork is a narrative. What I mean by that is that when a writer writes, he expects you to follow the same order of the letters and of words and the pages that he writes. You may not, but that's what he expects for you to understand and fuse with his meaning. But with art, say with a sculpture, you can start at any place and you can wander around the sculpture and still come to an understanding of it. With a painting, it's not purely a narrative, like you might have a very bold colour or an unusual shape that most people naturally gravitate to, but mostly it's a narrative. So you don't have the narrative element that Gadamer has his whole theory based on. The problem is with most art schools, they grab that theory that doesn't work with art and it's imputed into the lectures and the teaching in art school. And that's one of the main reasons that we use Gadamer to say that the artist doesn't matter, the intention doesn't matter, and you can have multiple meanings. You can have multiple meanings of a piece of work. The problem is, Derrida and Barthes both spoke mainly about text as well. So a lot of their theory, and a guy called Michel Foucault we'll come to in a minute, a lot of their theory is misapplied when we look at a narrative art. There is an issue, there's a problem. There's a problem. All of these people also spoke about the public rules of any kind of work. And they would say, because there are public rules, you don't need the author's intention, because there are public rules. There is public qualities to do with writing in texts. That was one of Wittgenstein's main arguments about language, that it's essentially public. And they would say the same thing, it's public, which is true. But we don't have the same rules that govern art, as you know. We don't have the same strict rules to do with what colours we mix, to do with grammar structures, and to do with just with basic things like the sequence of reading texts. Those sorts of rules, those public rules, aren't quite the same in the visual arts. Okay, moving on quickly, Derrida. He was from 1930 to 2004. He spoke about many things. He coined the phrase deconstruction and undecidables. You've probably heard of that. Derrida wrote about turning the text in on itself and deconstructing it. He spoke of undecidables and la différence and play. His writing is very complex, but in essence he maintained that the meaning of any work is always deferred. What he meant by that is, again, it's text, so it doesn't work. He would say, when you look at a text, how do you know the meaning of a word? Well, you look up the meaning of the word. But when you've looked up the meaning of that word in a dictionary, the words that describe that word need to be looked up. Every word you're looking at, if you put it in inverted commas, you need to look the next word up. So you never get to any grounded meaning. Meaning is always deferred. The problem is that doesn't happen in the same way with art, does it? Because if you look at the colour red or blue, there are certain innate responses we have to those colours that neurologists would say to us. So red has certain feelings, maybe anger or passion. There's no deferring going on there. So his theory, although it's taken by so many art schools into art theory, it's misapplied. Another issue is if he says that meaning is always deferred, you can never know the meaning of it, is that applicable to his own writing? Can I read his writing and say, I don't think it means that meaning is always deferred? No, I think it means that the artist is important and intention is where meaning is found. Can I do that with his writing? Is meaning always deferred in his own writing? Lastly, French philosopher Roland Barthes. He wrote a seminal work in 1967 called The Death of the Author, really, really famous, where he said, and again there's some truth in this, that all writing is just, he called, a textile of quotations. There's truth in that, isn't there? He's saying that we have innumerable sources that we can't pinpoint that influence us, phrases, words, experiences. So when we say anything or write anything, particularly writing, we're just quoting. It's just quotations from innumerable sources, so that means there's no author. There's no author. There's so many million authors that there's no author. That's what he concluded. So the death of the author. All these leading figures argue that everything we do is a consequence of the personal baggage of where we have come from. We're just coated in this baggage, It's weighing us down so we can't ever truly understand anything. Okay, they are the chief people, apart from Michel Foucault that I'll mention in a minute. I just want to mention briefly the social, political, economical background, because all these people are telling us it's the baggage of our lives that tell us what meaning is, but a lot of them refuse to explain or talk about the baggage that affected their own theories. But all of these people were men of certain times, and I just want to have a look at that very quickly with you. So how did we get to such a place of this postmodern pluralism of meaning? Well, I want to look at the rise and fall of modernism very, very quickly with you. Modernism had its roots in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. The Renaissance and the Reformation focused on the individual mind, the creator. It used to be like that. It was chiefly humanist, modernism, and optimistic, looking to the future. The strength of mankind. Man will get better and better and understand things more. So with reason and knowledge, mankind can get to the truth, and truth can make a better mankind. But then something happened. Modernism crashed with one or two very, very effective, powerful events in history. There's a professor of philosophy and aesthetics at Lancaster University called Colin Lyas, and he will particularly mention this as something that revolutionised hermeneutics and understanding meaning in art. The Battle of the Somme, a turning point. World War I, Battle of the Somme, 1916. On its first day, there were 60,000 British casualties. Over 1.5 million casualties by the end of the battle. And this had a massive dehumanising effect. They were just numbers. You go and look at the unmarked grave of soldiers in northern France. Just numbers. Massively dehumanising. The humanist optimism of modernism never quite recovered from there. Next. Have you noticed? New criticism, 1920s, just after the Battle of the Somme. This is when one of the major turning points happened in theory to do with text and art. New criticism. They said meaning is found in the work alone. It has nothing to do with the writer or the artist. What you say has nothing to do with it. It has nothing to do with who you are, what century you lived in, what your culture was, what your beliefs were, what your religion was. It's just in the work. They rejected biography and all sociological matters. The human mind was not important. Meaning was only found in the work. 1939 to 1945, Second World War. Second World War. This was the death blow to modernism and all the optimism that it espoused. Nazism, National Socialism, came from one of the most educated, advanced nations on earth. 1 year on, 1946, this is the most pivotal document in all the arguments that you'll ever hear about intentionalism, here and in any book you ever read. This document, The Intentional Fallacy, by Wimsatt and Beardsley. They said, intention of the author is neither available, okay, I understand that to a certain extent, maybe Cartesian dualism, yes, that the mind and the body is separate. How can I really understand what's going on in someone's mind? They're closed, I can't really get to it. Maybe there's some truth in that, but not desirable as a standard for judging the success of a work of literary art. So, even if I could tell you exactly what I intended in a work, and you understood it perfectly, you don't want it. It's not desirable to know what a work means. Again, intention just comes from the text itself. Something else New Criticism did with the intentional fallacy is they were the first people to say meaning can change. They write about a poem that speaks about raising his plastic arm hundreds of years ago. And they say that although plastic was not invented in those days, 500 years ago, you can now say that that line means plastic. Yeah, manufactured plastic, because the meaning changes. They were the first people to do that. Okay, moving on. Something else radically changed things. The 1968 Paris student riots. Massive deal. Massive deal. It was the largest general strike of an industrialised country. Students were joined by 10 million workers. Can you imagine that in today's society? 10 million workers striking with you on campus in Canterbury in Kent, and students all over the country. All over the country. 10 million striking, rioting. It wasn't like the riots in London a couple of years ago. Massive, massive, much more influential. It nearly caused the collapse of the French government, and it broke permanently traditional views of education, gender, politics, and many other worldviews. And it was during this upheaval that Roland Barthes, the man previously mentioned, wrote The Death of the Author. When all the stability that they looked at, the people you could trust, people disagreed with and didn't believe in anymore, it's when he wrote The Death of the Author. The author was seen as an illegitimate authority that controlled the meaning of a work, like the illegitimate government. And it must be stopped. The author must die. Okay, to conclude our short look at the background of the debate, the French riots greatly affected 3 French philosophers who became the most influential thinkers about authorship and intention. So let me just mention these people very briefly. First of all, you've probably heard of him, very well known, Michel Foucault, French postmodernist, lived 1926 to 1984. He wrote a book or an article just after Roland Barthes' Death of the Author called What is an Author? And he said that the interest in authorship is modern, and it's only for one thing. It's because of modern copyright issues. That's my work. How can I keep my work safe? I say I'm the author, I get a copyright. That's the only reason. It wasn't for meaning purposes, it was just for financial purposes with copyright. I think I can clearly show you that's not true at all. Jacques Derrida, we mentioned him before. Deconstruction. Meaning is always deferred or undecidable. Roland Barthes, to give a text an author, he said, to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text. You want to have multiple meanings for every text. Okay? Think about your shopping list. Think about giving that to someone and seeing if they can come up with multiple meanings for your shopping list. Okay, intentism. Who are we then? Intentism is a movement of artists, authors and musicians who believe that art can convey an artist's intended message. Even with all this baggage of your lifestyle, my lifestyle, I believe your work you can bring a message. You can be a pioneer in society. You can move people, show people things, speak to people through your artwork. As a movement, it both recognises and celebrates a relationship between an artist's creation and its creator. All meaning is simply the imperfect outworking of intention. Okay. This is the bulk or the rest of my talk. We're going to look at the 3 places where you can find meaning. There's no other place. 3 places. You can either find it in the work, analyse the work closely enough, get to the meaning, or you can look at the viewer, or you can look at the artist's intention. The work, the viewer, or the artist's intention. So, without further ado, let's have a quick look at the work. Let's start with literature, and then we're going to come and look at visual art. We'll look at literature now, and I think what we'll do is after we've looked at literature, take us 5 minutes, then we'll have a break. Yeah?
Quick 10-minute break, toilet break.
Yeah? So let me just briefly look at literature and how meaning can or can't be found in literature, in text. Then we'll look at visual art after the break. Okay, so literature is composed of arbitrary sounds and shapes called words. This might sound implausible, as words do appear to mean things. But the founder of modern linguistics, Saussure, said something that's quite true. If I pick up a pen, there's nothing pen-like about that pen. You could call it any sound you want. And in other languages, there is called another sound. It's just pen in English. So there's nothing that is intrinsically pen-like. So it's arbitrary sounds. Arbitrary sounds. This is the man, Saussure. The connection between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. The connection between the sound pen and that thing is arbitrary. It could be anything else. It could be anything else. We have a problem straight away now, though, don't we? Because if words are arbitrary, then how can we have meaning fixed in those words? How can we have meaning fixed if words are arbitrary? Okay, give you an example. The meaning of nada. Okay, so in Spanish, can be nothing. In Hindi, thread. In Indonesian, it's tone. So the same word, if I read it, I don't know the meaning in the text. I've got to find out what nationality, what language the author was writing in. From that one word alone, I don't know the meaning. Very briefly then, let me have a look at these 4 areas, because there's another problem. Number 1, language, words are arbitrary sounds. Okay? Number 2, those words change. Those words change. And I'm going to give a quick example of 4 areas where words change over time. So again, like the plastic arm, how do you know what this meaning is if it changes over time? Okay, so first of all, let's have a look at verbs very, very quickly. Verbs. Stative and dynamic verbs. Let me put that down so I can say it more quickly. In English, there are 2 types of verbs, dynamic and stative. Dynamic are verbs when you do something. I'm walking, I'm talking, I'm thinking. Action, dynamic verbs. Only dynamic verbs can you say them with an ing. Yeah? It's called a present participle. I'm talking, I'm thinking, dynamic verbs. State verbs, I am, yes, I have a pen. State verbs, you can't put an ing on them. If you say I'm having, different meaning. That means I'm experiencing. But ownership, state verb, you can't put an ing on it. And yet we have I'm loving it. Utterly wrong grammatically. Every grammar book would say terrible. And yet, because of McDonald's, people are saying it. And in a few years' time, because of language evolves, that will be considered grammatically correct. I can give you numerous examples where these verbs have changed over the centuries. Naturally. Because English is organic. Language is organic. It changes. Okay? So how do we find meaning in a work if the words change over the years? If that's our only place for meaning. Nouns, wag, okay? Is that wag your finger? Or is that wag the acronym for wives and girlfriends of famous footballers? We have a different meaning for it. Which one does it mean? I need more than that word to know it. Adjectives, gay. Obviously, for centuries, that would mean some kind of feeling of happiness and contentment. But now it means homosexual. In fact, I would think very rarely would you find anything where that meant what it meant 50, 100, 200 years ago. So it's completely changed. We'll ask you tag questions. He liked you. This needs the auxiliary. Doesn't. He. That's what it needs to be. He liked you. Whenever you have something in the positive, it needs something in the negative. You don't like that, do you? He liked you, doesn't he? It needs to be positive to negative. There's no negative here. That's wrong. You need to have the auxiliary does. There's no auxiliary. You need to have he, there's no he. Completely wrong, and yet that's what a lot of people say these days, is in it. And I can guarantee in a few years' time that will be considered accurate as well. So language changes, so it's not fixed. So I'll end there, but that's just one example where looking at meaning of words in a text is not always the best solution, because it might change with language and it might change over time and generation, or the types of people that are using it. You've got to go beyond that. Okay, should we have a break?
Quick break, 10 minutes?